All right, so Tory Lanez is sentenced to 10 years in prison. And before we get into it, I'm just curious, were you pleased with the verdict or were you upset with it? Do you think it was a fair sentence or do you think it was excessive? Actually, I know there's a lot of you who feel like Tory Lanez was wronged in this situation. You still might even believe that he was not guilty. But for the purpose of sentencing, the judge is ultimately going to respect the jury's verdict. And as we all know at this point, he was on trial for assault with a semi-automatic weapon, carrying an unregistered and loaded firearm in a vehicle, and gross negligent discharge of a firearm. And ultimately, the jury found him guilty on all three of those counts. And the defense immediately filed their motions for a new trial. If you believe that there's been some sort of prejudicial error in the trial, then you can file a motion basically saying, hey, we deserve another shot at this because that's no pun intended, right? And so you're essentially arguing that you deserve another bite at the apple because there were errors that were so prejudicial so as to rob him of a fair trial. And so they were making an argument that there was evidence that had been improperly admitted, including social media posts. There was the issue about the DNA evidence, but ultimately the motion for a new trial was denied. And so the defense is appealing both the conviction and the sentence. And in attacking the sentence, they're basically going to be arguing that it was excessive, basically that the punishment did not fit the crime. And the defense has already indicated that along with their challenge of this sentence, they're going to make a request for bail. And this would be typical. I mean, if you're challenging the sentence, let's just say your appeal of the sentence gets granted and for whatever reason, the appellate court finds that the sentence was excessive or otherwise unfair, you wouldn't want to have your client just sitting in prison for nothing if the sentence is being challenged. So you might want to make a request for bail so he can be out pending the challenging of the sentence. But the reality is that motion is absolutely going to be denied. I mean, at the end of the day, he is going to be considered a danger to the community. The jury found him guilty of some serious offenses. Not only that, but he's going to be considered an extreme flight risk. I mean, he's been sentenced to 10 years, which means that he would have zero incentive whatsoever to come back once he's released. Not only that, there's some immigration issues that we'll touch on a little bit later, but a judge is just going to find that he would be the ultimate flight risk and there's no possible chance of him getting out in bail. So as far as the sentence itself, Tory Lanez was facing up to 22 years in prison. And the reality is that was his max exposure. And that would be, what happens in the very worst case scenario. And I'll be honest with you, the very worst case scenario almost never happens. But at the end of the day, the DA was asking for 13 years and the judge ultimately landed at 10. But interestingly enough, the defense was asking for him to be released to a residential rehab facility. And I just kind of found that really surprising. Ultimately their reasoning for requesting that was they said that Tory Lanez suffers from alcohol abuse disorder and anxiety and post-traumatic stress. And this stemmed from his mother passing away when he was just 11 years old. And, that's obviously just a tragic story. And, my heart definitely goes out to him. No child should have to go through something like that. The judge was just unmoved by this request. And, judges can and oftentimes do sentence people to residential rehab facilities so that they can address their addictions. Because, sometimes people get caught up in, assault type charges, theft offenses, things like that. And, rather than to send that person to jail or to prison, a judge has the discretion to allow them to go to a residential rehab facility. But the reality is on these facts, there was just no chance at this happening. And so I was kind of surprised when I heard that's what the defense was asking for, because you want to make sure that the sentence that you're arguing for is at least going to be within the realm of possibility. And so when you have, exposure being 22 years and then the DA asking for 13, to come down at residential rehab just is pretty astonishing to me. I would more expect them to come back at somewhere between 5 to 8 years. And I just think that might have been a lot more reasonable. But Tory Lanez submitted a lot of positive information at sentencing, and mean, that's exactly what you want to do. Submitting a bunch of letters of support like he did. In fact, there was a video that was played which showed him as a philanthropist, a volunteer, a loving, great father, and there were a bunch of letters of support, and those can oftentimes be helpful too. When you have letter after letter after letter of people saying that he's a good brother, he's a good son, he's a good father, he's a hard worker, all these good things, that can be persuasive in some cases. In this case, I don't know that really any of that stuff ultimately would have had an effect, because again, I mean, he got sentenced to 10 years. I think the judge might have just saw that the DA overshot a bit and, you know, ended up sentencing him to 10. But, you know, maybe some of the positive information had an effect. But he did comment on how it was difficult to reconcile the person accused and convicted of these offenses with the loving father and the good friend and the philanthropist. And that's oftentimes the case. I've represented people who have dedicated themselves to a life of crime, but the vast majority of our clients are hardworking, everyday people who just for a brief period in time made a bad decision that they will forever regret and found themselves caught up in a bad situation. And sometimes those situations are very serious. And so you have a person who their family, friends, coworkers speak so highly of, and maybe they have no criminal history at all, but yet they committed an offense that lands them in some pretty deep trouble. So the other thing that Tory Lanez is facing besides this 10-year sentence is deportation. So Tory Lanez is a Canadian citizen. He's not a US citizen. And so because he's been convicted of what's considered under immigration law to be a crime of violence, and he's been sentenced to a term that's over a year, that's going to be considered an aggravated felony. And an aggravated felony is one of the worst things that you can have under immigration law. So essentially, after he serves his sentence, he will be placed in what are called removal proceedings. And unfortunately, there's just not going to be any defenses available to him to avoid deportation. So once he's done with his sentence and he goes through that process, you know, Tory Lanez is just never going to be able to come back to the United States, which is just a tragic ending to this story. If you're a Meg Thee Stallion fan, you probably got some sort of closure on some level. And if you're a Tory Lanez fan, then the injustice just continues, and that's unfortunate. But again, based on the facts, based on how the jury came back with this sentence was more or less to be expected. I did not at all see the judge coming back with anything within single digits, so 10 years was probably going to be the minimum. All right, well, if you got something out of this, please show me some love, hit the like button, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications so you never miss a new video when it drops. And as always, I want to thank you so much for watching. And until next time, peace.